In this two-part video, two parts as there's so much to talk about, I want to discuss an object that will be the most visible item of the royal regalia during the King's coronation next May, St Edward's crown. It was the crown that was used for the crowning of the late Queen, and she, like all the sovereigns who have ever worn it, and not all sovereigns have, wore it only once in her lifetime, and the King will also wear it only once in his lifetime too. It's an important example of the late 17th century goldsmith's craft, and I will discuss the making, form, decoration and use of the present St Edward's crown in part 2. But by way of an introduction to the crown's significance, in this first video I'm going to answer a couple of questions that rather surprisingly never seem to get asked, either by anyone here on YouTube or in writings elsewhere. Why does England, and now of course the United Kingdom, have a separate coronation crown at all? And why is it called St Edward's crown? Well, these are really fascinating questions, and in this video I will try to answer them as I explore the deep spiritual and symbolic significance of St Edward's crown. In order to answer these questions, we have to go back to the middle of the 13th century when the crown was first introduced and used, and explore the deep devotional relationship between a medieval king, King Henry III, and one of his sainted Anglo-Saxon predecessors, King Edward the Confessor. Thank you to everyone who's subscribed to the channel in recent weeks, and welcome to you all. Thanks to my loyal subscribers and those who have kindly supported me. A really lovely community of people is beginning to form here. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. And if you want to receive a notification every time I have a new video, please press the bell icon. And you can help support my channel at PayPal and buy me a coffee. Details are below in the description box and links on the homepage. Prior to the English Civil War, there were in fact two separate sets of English royal regalia, each with a distinct function. One set of regalia was kept in Westminster Abbey permanently, and this was used only for the coronation, and this included St Edward's crown. There was a separate set of state regalia that remained with the sovereign, and it included a second crown, which in the Middle Ages was known as the Great Crown, in Tudor times as the State Crown, and now is known as the Imperial State Crown. If you want to know about its history, I've done a separate video on it. The coronation regalia in Westminster Abbey, with St Edward's crown at its centre, seems to have first been used in August of 1274 at the coronation of King Edward I. Henry III, Edward I's father, had a strong devotion to his predecessor, the penultimate Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. Westminster Abbey, where the coronation took place, had been founded by the Confessor, and in it he was buried. Henry, in the middle of the 13th century, decided to completely rebuild Westminster Abbey, creating a new burial place for the Confessor, a new place for the coronation ceremony to take place, and a new mausoleum for himself and his family. And I'll talk about that work in a later video. Edward the Confessor had originally been buried before the high altar of the Abbey church, and in 1102 his coffin was opened and his remains were said to be fragrant, a sign of sanctity, and he was found wrapped up in a pall of precious fabric with a crown on his head and a sceptre in his hand. Edward was canonised, and he was declared a saint in 1161 by the Pope of Rome, and was granted the title of a confessor, someone who had lived an exemplary, chaste life of faith and holiness. After his canonisation, Edward was reburied in a new shrine in Westminster Abbey on the 13th of October 1163, and at that translation of his relics, a ring was taken from his finger containing a sapphire that is now set in the cross on top of the imperial state crown. On the 13th of October 1269, he was translated once again to a newly constructed shrine that King Henry III had made for him behind the high altar of the Abbey church, where his body was placed inside a golden ferretry, a golden casket. The relics of the saint are still enshrined, now enclosed in an iron-bound chest commissioned by James II, within the base of that 1269 shrine. Now, the first mention we have of St Edward's crown is coincidentally in the reign of King Edward I. There is a memorandum in the Public Record Office of all the things required for Edward I's coronation. And as well as mentioning the need for St Edward's crown to be present, it also mentions St Edward's mantle, St Edward's ring, perhaps the ring removed in 1163, and St Edward's verge or staff as among the items that were to be used. And it seems likely, given that this crown is not mentioned at all in any record before this point, that St Edward's crown and all of these other objects used at Edward I's coronation were in fact the Confessor's grave goods that had been removed from Edward the Confessor's coffin by Henry III in 1269, and that the crown, St Edward's crown, was the mortuary crown of Edward the Confessor that had been seen on his head in 1102. In which case, St Edward's crown used at the coronation of English kings until Charles I was not simply a practical object, it was a spiritually charged sacred relic. Now, to the medieval mind, the contact between the crown and the body of the Confessor, as they both lay together in the Confessor's coffin, transferred to that crown some of the Confessor's own spiritual power and his sanctity. So to be crowned with the Confessor's crown was to impart symbolically on the king the saint's own blessing, but was also to make a point that the present regime in the 13th century was a continuance of that of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which brought with it a sense of political legitimacy. Now, all of these things were really important to Henry III and Edward I, and the Liber Regalis, the coronation order probably created in the reign of Edward I and first used at the coronation of his son Edward II. A coronation oath is introduced in which the king swears to keep the laws, customs and franchises granted to the church and its clergy by the glorious King St Edward, his predecessor. Having two distinct sets of regalia is not a wholly English thing. The French had separate coronation crowns and personal crowns too. The coronation crown of the French, destroyed at the French Revolution, had similar mystical resonances to St Edward's crown. Known as the Crown of Charlemagne, thus linking the French throne to the early medieval Frankish kings and the early Holy Roman Emperors, it was probably made for Charlemagne's grandson Charles the Bald in the 9th century, and was originally a simple gem-studded circlet. Fleurs-de-lis, a symbol of the Virgin Mary, were added in the 12th century, and arches later still. Like St Edward's crown, it was only used for the coronation of the French kings, wherever that may be, and in France it did tend to move around, and the rest of the time it was secured in the great treasury of Saint-Denis. When Henry III extracted St Edward's crown from the Confessor's coffin, he must have had some awareness of this French tradition, and may have been consciously attempting to emulate it with a crown that had similar political and religious overtones. One of the first actions King Henry VIII took in the English Reformation in the 1530s was to suppress the cult of saints, and shrines and relics of the saints were destroyed. But the shrine of Edward the Confessor was not entirely eliminated. His remains were taken from their golden ferretry, which was destroyed, but they were placed inside the superstructure of his shrine. St Edward's crown and the regalia relics, having a purpose beyond just devotion, were not destroyed, but they were to some extent rebranded. There had long been a suggestion that St Edward's crown, as well as having an association with Edward the Confessor, was also the coronation crown of Anglo-Saxon kings, and that it had been used to crown King Alfred and all the line of Saxon kings up to the Confessor. So the crown was for a time rebranded King Alfred's crown. The box the crown was kept in had a label on it describing it as the chief crown of the two English crowns and connecting it with Alfred and his successors. Now, this rebranding, this alternative title for the crown was really useful in Protestant England as it detached from the crown the truth of its origin, that it was a saint's relic rather than simply a royal relic. And so we had the very curious spectacle for the next century after the English Reformation of a series of Protestant kings and queens, ending with Charles I being crowned effectively with a Catholic relic. So what did this medieval St Edward's crown look like? Well, we have very little that is firm to go on. We do have a description of it, a very brief description, in a manuscript in the collection of the Society of Antiquaries, which dates from 1649. It's an awful thing to read, as it's an inventory made when the Commissioners of Parliament came to remove the regalia to the Tower of London so that the gold and silver within them could be converted into coin by the mint. At this point, both the state regalia and the coronation regalia, now unused, were being kept together in Westminster Abbey. In the inventory, the crown is referred to as King Alfred's crown, no doubt guided by the label on the box, and is said to be made of gold wire work, which presumably means it's made of gold filigree of some sort, or that elements are wired together. It's not clear. But it does suggest that the band of the crown is not solid like the present St Edward's crown. It was certainly of lighter manufacture because there was a considerable difference in weight between the state crown and the medieval St Edward's crown. The state crown's gold weighed 7 pounds, while St Edward's crown was 79 ounces, 2 pounds lighter. St Edward's crown was also much less lavish. The state crown was studded with a lot of stones, while St Edward's crown was set with light stones, the inventory says. In total, the value of St Edward's crown was less than a quarter of that of the state crown, £248, while the state crown was valued at £1,100. Now, unlike the state crown, there are many illustrations of that. There are really no satisfactory images of what St Edward's crown, the medieval St Edward's crown, looked like. On the chantry of King Henry V, there is a sculpture that shows the king being crowned with a low spreading crown with fleur-de-lis and arches arranged in a close-fitting helmet form. We can assume that this is a portrayal of St Edward's crown, and it might give some indication of its general form, but the sculpture is sadly very badly damaged. There is the very intriguing reference in the inventory to St Edward's crown having 2 little bells attached to it. We can't be certain what these were, but they may well be the sort of dangly bits you get on Byzantine imperial crowns, which are called pendella. I think the closest we're going to get to any sense of what the medieval St Edward's crown looked like in form is the Holy Crown of Hungary, the Crown of St Stephen, as it's otherwise called, a crown made in Byzantium in the 1070s. The Holy Crown of Hungary is quite lightweight. It is made of different sections that have been wired together, all these sections decorated with enamel. It is very slightly set, with only a few semi-precious stones, and has a low set of arches on the top, surmounted with a cross. And of course it has pendella hanging from it at the sides and at the back. It's tempting to think that this is the sort of crown St Edward's crown was. Beyond the guesswork, this long destroyed relic crown of St Edward the Confessor remains an enigmatic mystery. But of course, this relic is resurrected in a new form, and it's that new crown, the present incarnation of St Edward's crown, that we will look at in the next video. Thanks very much for watching.